sustainability leaders to create value. And I mean value in every sense of the word. Value for your company, value for our planet, precisely the work that you all are doing day in and day out. I will just say that I come at this from a slightly different perspective than some of you that I heard from in the breakout groups. I'm a consultant. I'll say a little bit more about who FSG is. We work on strategy work with companies, oftentimes on social and environmental impact. So I often get the pleasure of working with clients for 3 months, 6 months at a time on a very specific problem or strategy. So the perspective that I can offer you today is less as the technical expert deep in one thing and more sort of stepping back and that chance to come together with folks from across industries thinking about what are some of the common challenges, and then I can offer a little bit about some of the practices and tools that we have used to move through those challenges, certainly not solve them. They're big, meaty issues that you all are dealing with every day, but begin to chart a course and help companies move forward down that path. So a little bit, I'll give some examples and talk through that a little bit. But just quickly, I think it's helpful to know a little bit about who I am and my perspective. I am based in California and I have worked with FSG for about 10 years. FSG is a global nonprofit social and environmental impact consulting firm. We do primarily strategy and evaluation work. We've worked with over 1,000 clients worldwide across industries and geographies, and we've published a lot about our work in helping companies create that value, again, sort of with multiple meanings of the word value, thinking about value for the company, whether that's competitive advantage, growth, revenue reduction, or revenue, all of those pieces, or whether it's the impact for society and the planet. You heard a little bit from some of our speakers this morning. I think Fawn from Intel mentioned their purpose, right? And I think it's helpful to say that I really come at this with the belief that companies have a purpose, right? They are created oftentimes to solve a problem, to offer a particular product or solution, and the perfect purpose goes well beyond profit. I think everybody here is aligned around that, and there's all of these different ways that companies can activate that, a portfolio of approaches, and I think one of the things that you'll hear me talk about is sometimes the ability to look across these. Again, I think it's a challenge we've heard from you all that sustainability teams often are actually that influence without authority, trying to leverage these different parts of the business. So it's exactly that sort of shared premise about how to activate that purpose and really create the ends and that you all are working towards every day. We've heard some about this. I'll go quickly through this because I think this is what you all are living every day, but I also think this is a group of sustainability leaders, and so you're often on the front end of this transition. We know that sustainability has shifted and is continuing to shift, and also that we need to move faster, right, for this, all of our sakes. So this is something that I'm sure we can read about, but I see in my work folks moving from that orientation of reporting, compliance, and cost savings to that idea of sustainability as a value add, something that's really going to be a driver of value for the future. That there has been, I think, historically more siloed leadership of sustainability, and increasingly today across many of our companies that we work with, our clients, there is more of an intention, and sometimes it's a challenge, to link across more of that elevation of sustainability to the C-suite, all really positive and part of this opportunity. And then I think that there has been sort of a past orientation sometimes to the incremental improvements, right, within a company benchmarked against itself or benchmarked against an industry. And we've moved, as folks have acknowledged, to really a higher order challenge, right, to move at speed and scale towards science-based targets on so many of the sort of issues, right, climate, biodiversity, resource use that we all really care about. So I just wanted to sort of say this because I think it's framing the next piece that I'll offer, which is we know where we're trying to get to, and when I sort of step back and look across the conversations I've had over the last 12 to 18 months, there's really 3 questions that I hear a lot of our clients asking. The first is, what is the internal work required to activate our company's capabilities at the speed and scale that we need to and are talking about, aspiring to? And so I think we've talked with a lot of companies and really thought about what are those enabling conditions inside a company? What are its culture? It's some other things that we can talk about as some of the tools and practices that go with that to try to address that internal work. It's too often, and I have been guilty of this, you sort of design a perfect strategy, and then what? right? We've talked about, I heard in the breakout group, people asking this question about how do I get more employees engaged? I think often, whether it's sustainability or we also do a lot of work in equity, the middle managers are key, right? So we can talk a little bit about that. The second question that I hear a lot is, and this has been more recent, I'll say, is a question about how can we work better at the intersection of climate and social goals, particularly goals that intersect between climate and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I think there's just sort of a big white space and an opportunity for companies to really seek the co-benefits across the set of goals and to have a more coordinated approach there, a more integrated approach. And the third, if you can't tell, I'm sort of moving from internal to more increasingly external. The third question that I hear sometimes as a frustration is how can we really implement to our goals and targets if we really don't directly control so much of the infrastructure and policy and supports that are required. And that is something I heard this morning. Even folks were talking about scope 3. I mean, it's a huge challenge. There's not an easy fix, but one of the things that, actually, Marilyn, I think you talked about systems thinking, and we do a lot of that with clients. Really, how can we think about this in terms of a system and in terms of how to shift that system? So I'll go through these one by one and say a little more and then offer an example. For the first, we're really talking about processes, norms, and attitudes that can interfere with change. I think we really see that a net zero strategy, and especially one that kind of does begin to integrate equity, cannot be successful without really thinking about those underlying conditions, some of the really precursors or accompaniments of change and really transformational change. So in best case scenario, it's sort of that virtuous cycle where you are kind of unblocking things that are in the way and then reinforcing the things that are really helping to drive change. Some of the things that we see a lot are the corporate culture. How collaborative is it? Authentic leadership buy-in and allyship. Governance has come up today already. Effective measurement. Trusted relationships and allies, and I mentioned before the middle management piece. We spend a lot of our time often at the leadership level, and then there's so many questions once the strategy is established and the leadership is bought in about how to then really help drive that ownership and accountability across middle management especially. And just an open mindset, which is hard to describe sometimes, but I think that you heard some of the speakers this morning talk about curiosity, talk about staying, in some sense, open, right, to exploring those things. And I'll just say I think this sometimes we don't talk about as explicitly as we could as some of those enablers of our really excellent strategies and ideas and the goals that we set up, the roadmaps. So hopefully it's helpful. I think it's always useful to look at an example. There's a lot of intangibles that were on that previous slide, things around culture, around mindset, but I also think that these come to life in really tangible ways. So we've worked over many years with Enel Group. They're an energy company globally, and they have two examples that I think are helpful. One is they very early on invested in effective measurement and a proprietary platform. Their strategy was really to work in emerging markets first in some of their innovation and sustainability. They were sort of wanting to understand what was happening, how to understand that all the way through at the project level. They spent a fair amount of time developing this proprietary digital management platform to gain that visibility, to monitor impact and be able to report on it. And I think that, again, drove the transparency, it drove the buy-in, it helped to sort of make that case that continued to then generate and perpetuate the leadership and kind of allyship that we were talking about before. And the other example from Enel is their work on inclusive processes and trust. Again, that idea of employee engagement in sustainability, and they really looked at innovation and sustainability as two sides of the same coin. So they have a platform which they named Open Innovability, and then they also have these innovation hubs. But the idea of the open innovation approach is that they're sourcing ideas from every employee, so the people who are closest to the problem, who are invested in figuring out solutions, and that employees have seen those ideas move through sort of essentially a competition process. And many of them have been resourced and built into new technologies, new platforms, new ideas for how they could be doing things. And that really runs across their business model, their product and technologies, and their operations. So in really kind of comprehensive ways. Anyway, so just two examples that are a bit more tangible, but that I think speak to some of those kind of internal conditions and drivers that can really help make that transformational change and essentially help the sustainability teams coordinate across the business at a broad level. The second thing, and again, this is something that we've had a lot of questions about in the last sort of 12 to 18 months, is really this intersection essentially of climate and equity, sustainability and equity. And we had the chance to dig into this a bit with a client earlier this year, and they really were asking some pretty important and basic questions about the sort of return on investment, how to make the business case of this. And we sort of worked with them to basically say, well, you can drive value sort of at that intersection of environmental and social goals in some key places, right? Your brand and reputation, thinking about your labor and talent. In this case, they were looking to expand physically, so they had a real interest in looking at sort of their social license to operate and their ability to go through that expansion process. And they were also really concerned about regulatory risk. I think increasingly, especially in the US context, there is more attention to questions of environmental justice under this federal administration and in certain state environments. And so they were really thinking about that and wondering how to, in some sense, get ahead of that. And you can see that actually all of these are sort of interlinked, but wanting to think through that with them and to think through how they could use their sustainability domains as a driver for that. I think that there are some real ways in which land use, water access and use, waste management, and supply chain, among others, were areas that they thought, oh, actually, we need to be better informed about some of the ways that sort of an equity agenda can show up and be integrated here. So one example, again, from the last year, we worked with a global food and beverage company, and they were asking a similar question, but specifically looking at their supply chain and looking at their downstream, their customers. So their goal was to say, how can we help our customers and really think about sort of three things: supply chain resilience, equity, and also helping to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We're really thinking about scope 3. We want to sort of partner with companies and with customers. So they, again, this was early work, but they chose two things to pursue. One was a little bit more in the kind of short to medium term, and that was looking at a combination of interventions or really offerings for their customers. They chose to focus on their small and medium enterprise customers. They were food and beverage, selling into cafes and some smaller hotels and things like that. So their sort of equity lens on this question was to really think about small and medium enterprises who have often had less resources and less focus put on them as members and part of the supply chain. So they combined training, incentives, and financial support, tools and resources, and then this sort of soft category of indirect support for the ecosystem, realizing that they were working with customers in various different places. Some of them were clustered together and some were not, but really needing to think about what was around that small and medium-sized company that could help support, not just sort of the more concrete offerings that they laid out. And the other thing that was more something that they were then going to build was looking at who had a similar set of customers. So they thought, could we essentially partner with energy companies in key geographies and markets, for instance, and think about what are the ways that we could actually sort of together partner and serve these customers in ways to drive, in this case, essentially the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. What could that look like? And it was a bit exploratory, but I think for them really exciting to think about that and again, kind of open up that aperture a little bit on what it might mean and think across sort of energy access, energy democracy, and sort of combine the greenhouse gas mitigation with some of their social equity goals. So the third thing, and again, this goes back to something you all heard a little bit about this morning, is this question that we hear about, how can we think about some of these issues and getting our arms around some of these issues when we don't really control so many of the inputs or the things that we rely on in terms of infrastructure or regulation and policy. And I'll just offer that for some of our clients, thinking very explicitly in terms of systems change has been really helpful. There's a picture of an iceberg here. Often I think we operate and see the tip of the iceberg, the sort of events clearly in front of us, what is sort of directly happening and in some sense quite tangible. But below that, there's this question of what's the pattern? What are the trends? And sort of what is driving that? What are the underlying structures that have influenced that? And then also the mental models. And again, this is the part that I think often can be the hardest, but I think is really true, especially for much of the work that we're doing. There's actually kind of a paradigm shift in the mindsets that we are asking people sometimes to make. And if we don't acknowledge that and explicitly consider that, it's quite hard to have it sort of effectively ladder up with as much leverage. So this is a little bit of just an offering and just that this way of thinking in terms of systems change and what are some of the kind of things beneath the water that are holding in place the existing systems that we are actually trying to shift and change. And we often think with companies about this on 3 different levels, and I put a couple of different examples here. There's obviously within the company, many of you work for large companies, and it is in and of itself a system, right? So you're thinking about maybe resourcing new business models, you're thinking about some of the mental models, how do we demonstrate and measure sustainability as a source of value, making that business case. But I also think there's these other pieces, and this is where it gets to the heart of that question. How do we think about the bigger ecosystem of which we're a part and on which we rely? Thinking about within the industry and the value chain, so thinking there's ways to think about resource flows. So I put the example of advanced purchase commitments for people who are working on innovative models or thinking about new market innovations. But there's also this question of relationships and power, and that gets sort of down, again, further beneath the iceberg. And an example is we've been working with a project to really think, again, about the supply chain and thinking about how do we increase supplier voice. And there was the example before of customer, but in this case, supplier voice in addressing Scope 3 emissions. So they're working very deeply in the auto industry and in the textile industry in the US and Mexico and India, and really asking that question, what does it look like to engage our suppliers in a deeper conversation about what these businesses need? Where's their starting point, right? What are their incentives, and sort of how can we then align and create a different ecosystem within our value chain to drive reductions in those Scope 3 emissions? And then there's sort of a broader question, right, within society, and I think this is probably something that you've heard about or many of you think about, but so often when I work with clients, we get sort of a window into one part of the business, but we're not necessarily getting a window into all of their lobbying efforts or other things. And so just really thinking about aligned lobbying and public policy advocacy as actually a key part of that systems change thinking and a way that each of your companies is leveraging that. And then also mental models. We work sometimes with corporate philanthropy in particular on this, so driving research, driving sort of new ideas, or funding into collaborations that are going to be able to really think about and set some different precedents, put out new data, new information to help shift the field and build on that. So again, just sort of 3 areas and an offering of 3 kind of tools and practices for how you all might think about sort of doing even more of the value creation that you're already doing as key sustainability leaders. Thanks.
Any questions, maybe?
Yeah, do we have time for questions? Sure. Do folks have questions? I know we also have the breakouts after. No? It was all very clear. Okay. Great.
All right, thank you, Laura.